Hello, hello, everybody. This is Molly Gordon, and let me just finish fiddling with a few tech things here. I'm delighted to be with you this morning for the first Happiness Hangout. I've got to change something here. I've got the conference line on my iPhone so that people can phone in. However, right now no one's on the line and it's hold music, which is kind of distracting. So, oh, there, somebody has come on the line. Just a moment. I'm going to start the recording. There's Yay! So come on here. Welcome everybody to the first Happiness Hangout. We've got a couple of people on the phone now. You want to say hi?
Hi Molly, this is Ellen Andrews from Boca Raton. How are you?
I'm great, Ellen. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
So happy to be there, Molly. Thank you.
You're welcome. Who else is here?
Hi, Ruth. Oh.
I heard Ruth. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, my name is Carol. I'm a friend of Ellen from Boca Raton.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, guys. It's great to have you here. And I know we've got folks watching on, let me just turn this off. I've got so many pieces of technology going in this moment who are watching live on air that we're not going to be able to see, but who may be participating by chat. So this is great. So I'm curious, guys, what drew you to a happiness hangout? Ellen, what drew you?
Oh, I love the topic. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I know there's a lot of research being done on positive psychology, and a lot of doing that work, and I'm just always fascinated to participate in anything related to positive psychology.
Right, right. What's not to love about feeling good, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. How about you, Carol?
Well, I just found out about this from Ellen, and like she does. I'm not a social worker or anything in the profession, but from a personal standpoint, learning and what there is out there about how to be happy, especially as we age, I think is a very interesting topic.
Okay, great. And Ruth? Maybe I got that other name wrong. Who knows? Is there anyone else on the line who'd like to check in about what's appealing about this topic?
It's Aurelia, actually.
Aurelia! How did I get Ruth out of that? Hi.
I don't know. Maybe another Ruth. Somebody named Ruth said something. But no, I think that I love the title, and I just think that anytime you can get a little piece of happiness, it's good.
Right, right. You know, for years and years and years, I thought of happiness as something to be attained. I told the story once on my blog of my husband asking me when we first met. He said, "So what's the meaning of life?" And without even thinking about it, I said, "Eternal happiness." And I realized in that moment that there was something in that was true for me, and it wasn't about chasing happiness. It wasn't about chasing pleasure. In that moment, I was connected with some deep truth about happiness being part of, it's like the ground of our being in our nature, and who we are, how we live, and how we love from this ground of happiness. And I thought at that time and through most of my life that it was something that was to be achieved or attained or reached, that happiness was a sort of outcome or destination. And what I've come to understand that I'm really excited about, and maybe the most, I think maybe the most revolutionary thing I've come to see in my life, which is saying a lot, I'm now, I'll be 61 in a month, is that happiness is not a destination, it's a default. That really we are hardwired, that our nature is happiness. And again, I'm not talking about pleasure, I'm not talking about rah-rah, jazzed up, although that's all great. I'm talking about happiness as a ground, as a context, a come from, not a go to. And how that happiness arises and emerges out of a wholeness that is just part of our being. And that what has intrigued me is that when we recognize this, we have a different navigational system for life. So there's one way to navigate life. I mean, many ways to navigate life, right? But one way is to navigate in search of happiness and to make choices looking for happiness. And that often looks like trying to manipulate things in the outside world. I'll be happy when I have a home. I'll be happy when my mortgage is paid off. I'll be happy when I find a mate. I will be happy when my mate and I have a family. I'll be happy when I find a job. I'll be happy when I retire. And happiness becomes contingent on external circumstances. And the point of life is to manipulate externals to arrive at this place called happiness. But if we turn that around and see happiness as an inside-out phenomenon, not as something we have to develop or achieve, but as something we are, then navigating becomes an entirely different thing. Navigating is about recognizing the thinking and the ways of being that are in line with that default kind of happiness and that keep us connected with that, and differentiating those from the ways of being and of thinking that take us away from happiness, that have us living and feeling like we're isolated, incomplete, dependent on outside circumstances to be happy. So it's a fundamental shift from happiness as something to be accomplished to happiness as something that we have, from happiness as something to navigate toward to happiness as something we navigate from. So I'm really curious what comes up for you guys when you hear that. And just to facilitate the conversation, I'm going to call names, but you're always welcome to say pass. And you're also welcome to just speak up and just say your first name so that I know who's talking. But Carol, I'll start with you. What does that do for you?
I'm going to have to sign up. My phone is my battery here is starting to die out, but I will connect with Ellen later and learn more about what you have to say. But thank you for letting me listen.
You're so welcome, Carol. Thank you for being here. So Ellen, I guess it's to you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Hi, Constance, my friend. Okay. Well, you know, I think it was, I don't know if it was Robert Holden or one of the psychologists who was speaking about positive psychology. It may have been who said this, but one of the researchers on happiness, the belief is that we are inherently happy and we have to remove the blocks to happiness that we're already born with. And so when I heard that, maybe a year or two ago. I forget when I heard it, but I remember as a child we lived on Long Island, and when I was 11 years old, my father and mother bought a boat. It was a 16-foot Boston Whaler, which was an open-hull boat. And I remember we used to take the boat out into the Atlantic Ocean or the local waterway. And I remember my spot on the boat was to sit on the bow of the boat, holding onto the railing, my little legs dangling off the bow of the boat. And, you know, it was the kind of boat that would be a speedboat and bounce along. And I just remember being so completely overjoyed when I was out in the water. I mean, not happy otherwise, but somehow that spot on the boat and just connecting with the water, it was bliss.
Yes.
At age 11. And so I remembered that moment of happiness was not related to anything other than, you know, going 30, 40 miles an hour in this open hull boat and being out with nature and the winds and the water and the sun. And it was beautiful happiness. Simple.
Yes.
Here it was.
Yes.
So I don't know if that relates to what you're talking about, but it had nothing to do with clothes or other people or relationships. It had to do with connection with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And for pure joy in the moment.
Exactly. And I think that piece about the pure joy in the moment is critical. Happiness doesn't exist in the past or the future, although sometimes we get caught up in thinking that says, you know, I was happy when, and if only I could have that again, which is, what could be more dead end than staking happiness on something that's past that no longer exists? Or I will be, yeah.
I was going to say that I think one of the experts coined the phrase happiness addiction. You know, this notion, I'll be happy when, it's some future thing.
Mm-hmm.
That goalpost keeps getting moved forward.
Exactly.
I'll be happy when, and you never really achieve it because it's always in the future.
Exactly, exactly. It's always deferred. And that's built into that structure. It's interesting. I hadn't really thought of this before, Ellen, but as soon as we make happiness contingent on something outside of us, it becomes, by definition, unattainable because it's away from the moment. And this moment is the only one in which we can experience happiness.
Well, years ago, I don't know if this is relevant, but it just popped into my mind. Years ago, I used to work at Miami Children's Hospital, and as a social worker and an educator, my job was to train pediatric residents in the psychosocial issues of doctors dealing with their patients. So I was in an educational role at the hospital, and I remember, because it was Miami, we had pediatric residents from a lot of countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, Guatemala, Jamaica. You know, it was a very international residency training program. And I remember one of the residents from Guatemala said to me, Ellen, you know, in America you have everything and you're happy, because in Guatemala we have a piece of bread and we're happy.
Yes.
And I thought that was an interesting wrinkle on happiness. You know, the question is the American culture generally unhappy because of the abundance of material things, and that we have forgotten what happiness means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
In terms of basic needs being met. I don't know. It struck me. That was back in 1982 when I was working there. So, I don't know. It's, you know, maybe it has to do with advertising, that there's so much advertising having to do with an idealized image of what happiness should be, that people, and especially today with maybe the models being airbrushed in magazines, or all the models or actresses who are 70 years old getting Botox or plastic surgery or fillers, that people who are regular people can't attain the beauty that seems to be popularized right now. Mm-hmm. Although sometimes I love watching PBS and British television because I see actresses with wrinkles.
Yes.
You know, American actresses don't seem to have wrinkles, by and large. Right?
Right.
I think people are losing track of what normal is.
Right.
But anyway, that's my thought of the day here.
Right. Well, I think, you know, the point about in Guatemala we have a piece of bread and we're happy. In the United States you have all this stuff and you're not necessarily happy.
Yes.
What that points to for me is that happiness is always a our ability to experience happiness is always determined by our thinking. And when I say thinking, I don't just mean our conscious thinking, you know, thoughts like an iceberg, and of the gazillion, I've heard tens of thousands of thoughts they say we have in a day. And we can only be conscious of a fraction of those, right? But the default happiness that I'm saying is our true nature is when it seems to be gone, when we are unhappy, it's obscured by our thinking in the moment. And the only thing that can obscure happiness, whether I'm in Guatemala or Nicaragua with a crust of bread, or in Hollywood getting my latest Botox treatment and then going shopping on Rodeo Drive, the only thing that can obscure happiness in either of those cases is thought. And my experience of well-being is always created then from the inside out rather than from the outside in.
Right. There was a cognitive therapist, I think it might have been Beck, you know, he wrote about how our thoughts largely determine our happiness, how we perceive them. Mm-hmm. And I always wondered, all the depression that people are feeling too, you know, is there a genetic component? And I think there is, to happiness. Some people are just, you know, maybe have lacking serotonin or some of the happiness chemicals. You know, my mother always said my brother was kind of born grumpy and I was born happy. You know, mm-hmm. And, you know, there were pictures of my brother as a little boy and he's kind of mad and stomping around, and I was kind of smile on my face.
Right.
And some of that, you know, who knows what happens in utero in terms of happiness chemicals.
True.
So I don't know. It's a complex notion of biochemistry, genetics, and attitude and history. So I think the question is, you know, given our genetics or anything else, how do we become happier through our thoughts, through our conscious attention, if we're not born with the genetics of happiness?
Right.
The degree that we might want, you know?
Right.
That's a hard struggle.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And, you know, I certainly don't have the answer to how genetics and biochemistry work in this. What I'm aware of is that there have been studies that take, quote, normal people, so people who are not diagnosed with depression or anxiety disorders, and give them the task to think, to worry, to think stressful thoughts and worry for, you know, like 15 minutes. And they're hooked up to brain measuring machines. And I think it's actually to a functional MRI. And they're able to show that just thinking stressful thoughts for 15 minutes changes what's going on in the brain. So,
well, I think it was cancer.
Well, so while it's true, apparently, that structural things in the brain can affect mood, we can also affect it the other direction.
There was a woman named Candace Pert. Are you familiar?
Yes, Candace Pert.
Yeah, who wrote Molecules of Emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, she was an NIH, I think it was an NIH-based research study. And I have a background in science. I even had a little trouble understanding the book. It was a challenge. But, you know, the notion that peptides are being squirted out of cells when we have emotion. And I think it's, you know, a little bit beyond my ability to fully understand it. But I think it's a very complex topic of, you know, and the question I think of, you know, people are born not so happy. You know, how do people achieve, you know, what do people do to be happier?
Right.
And I think that's probably the question that people are signing up for the phone call to find out. You know, how do they take, you know, a death of a loved one, or financial stress, or illness, or disability, or relationship loss, or all the, you know, things that we go through in this life. How do we take all the challenges and be happy in the midst of this soup?
Right.
Doom of life that we all have to endure, and turn it from an enduring experience to a enjoying experience.
Right.
I think that's what listeners probably want to know.
That's great and so well stated. It occurs to me that it might be valuable to distinguish happiness as a happiness as pleasure or enjoyment, and happiness as a kind of a background, or what I'm calling a default. So
I'm having a little audio problem. I couldn't hear that word. What was that word?
Happiness as a default, as a come from.
Oh, default setting. Okay.
Yeah, and so let's just take the loss of a loved one, for example.
Yep.
I remember when I lost my dad. I was quite young, 17, and I felt his death very keenly. And at the same time, there was a sweetness, and this was true for years. I grieved that. Every year in November, the anniversary of his death, I would have another wave of grief and mourning about him. But with that, there was a real sweetness, a feeling of richness, of re-experiencing my connection with him and our love for each other. And so the kind of happiness I'm talking about isn't in conflict with the ups and downs of the human experience. It's a happiness that is more fundamental than the day-to-day, week-to-week highs and lows we experience. And the one. Go ahead.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, can you share your strategies with how you get to that default setting, whether it is a death or a financial challenge or a loss or a violation of something in business or whatever?
Right.
How do you kick that in to be the default?
Right. So when those things happen, when we're having those highs and lows, how do we take those in and still experience that default of happiness? Exactly. And what my understanding is, and what my experience is, that when I see unhappiness, anxiety, when I see my ups and downs day to day as a function of my thinking, when I realize that I'm living in the feeling of my thinking, not the feeling of my father's death, not the feeling of the bills I have to pay, not even the feeling of the hot date I have tonight, which in my case would be with my husband, just in case anyone's wondering, that I'm living in the feeling of my thinking about those things, not of those things in themselves. And what that understanding allows us to do is it takes the, well, I talk about it as it allows us to see that in a very real sense, we're living in a movie. We're living in a construct created of our own thinking. And because of the marvelous way that life is designed and the way that consciousness brings thought to life and gives us a full-featured, full-on special effects, surround sound experience of whatever thought is giving rise to. So, for example, in the case of my father's death, a full, vivid experience of loss. And at the same time, we are always safe in our seats in the movie theater of life. That there's a way when I see that my experience is always generated by a thought, that I understand that whatever I'm experiencing, I'm fundamentally safe and whole. Does that make sense?
I was just wondering for the things for the listeners too, what's the technique you used, and what do you say to yourself to bring yourself back to happiness if you start to have other feelings that pull you out of happiness.
Right. How do you bring yourself back? For me, it's not so much about a tool or technique, although in any given moment, I think each of us may be guided to do something that helps restore us to equanimity. It might occur to me one day to take a walk. It might occur to me another time to meditate. But I think it's important to not look at it as trying to change the experience. Because if the experience is not a problem, if we recognize that we're living in an experience created by thought, we don't have to be afraid of the experience, no matter what it is. And when we're not afraid of it, and don't get in there and wrestle with it and try to change it, it changes spontaneously. That spontaneous shift may happen very quickly, or it may happen more slowly. But because thought is always flowing and always moving through us, it's not possible for it to hold still. Our experiences are also going to unfold. That movie is going to evolve and change, as long as I don't get in there and wrestle with it. Does that make sense, Ellen?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I have some background in neurolinguistic programming, and what I've kind of heard from what you say is, well, some of us are, have you heard about the primary channels with NLP, or neurolinguistic programming?
Yes.
Some of us are wired in the visual, in the auditory, or the kinesthetic. Have you been told that you're a kinesthetic person? Because when I said, how do you manage it, you said I take a walk or I meditate. So you described two kinesthetic activities. So maybe that your primary representation system may be action.
Yes, it might be. It might be. And for someone else, it could be reading something or calling a friend.
Yeah, or it could be just visualizing and picturing something, because according to neurolinguistic programming, some people are more visual, where they get pictures in their mind of things. Some people are more auditory,
right,
words and dialogue. Some people are more kinesthetic. They walk, they meditate. And I think it just occurred to me as we're speaking that maybe the listeners can better identify what's their primary representation system. How do they process the world? Do they tend to make pictures inside their head and images and movies? Do they tend to have dialogue and inner dialogue and thoughts, or being auditory, or do they tend to be kinesthetic and take walks and meditate? And what are they combinations of the following? Now, I learned when I took NLP that I'm a visual to kinesthetic. That's my process. I derive my feelings off the mental pictures I see in my mind. So if I'm seeing a movie, I'm deriving my feelings off the movie. So one of my ways to happiness might be to change my images and see a different movie, and then I'll feel happier by running a different film in my brain. And that's what I learned about myself. I'm very visual.
Right.
I'm just thinking for the listeners, they might want to think, see, how do they represent, what's their primary representation system pattern? Are they auditory to kinesthetic, meaning do they get their feelings off of what they tell themselves? Or do they go kinesthetic to kinesthetic, which you may be? You know, I'm not sure, I don't know you well enough in that regard, but, you know, taking walks and meditating,
right,
you go right away.
I think, though,
that may be an interesting thing for the listeners to figure out, geez, what's my process? And in doing so, maybe find out more hints to switch around if people are in a funk. Gee, am I thinking differently? Am I seeing pictures? Am I making a movie that's making me happy? Or can I tell myself something
right,
else, or take a walk and meditate? How can I shift out of this moment and switch my consciousness, switch my mood?
Right. And at the same time, I think it's really important that folks not get caught up on the technique. Because what I'm saying is that the direct realization that the experience is coming from thought, that direct realization spontaneously begins to create a shift. And that whether you're kinesthetic or visual or auditory, that as soon as you realize that what you're living in, that the uncomfortable experience, the unhappiness you're living in, is a function of thinking, not of external circumstances. And when you realize that that's always a flow, that it's nothing to be afraid of, then your own wisdom will kick in, and you don't have to figure out, am I auditory? You don't have to figure.
And just to clarify, though, if I can try to explain what I meant by that, the thing that was a breakthrough when I took this NLP course was that thinking, for me at least personally, it helped to understand the auditory, the visual, the kinesthetic, because I got to, for myself, it may not be true for everybody on the phone, but for me, I got to further understand that my thinking was much more specific for me than thinking. And I didn't realize to what extent I was so visual that my thinking was made up of visual pictures and some auditory, some inner dialogue. And then when I got to really analyze myself, where how does my thinking take shape? Is it in the form of mental pictures, or is it in the form of inner dialogue? And then I could kind of nip it in the bud, so to speak, and catch it and go, oh, I'm feeling bad because when I'm visualizing or when I'm telling myself. But at least for me, that diagnostic trick, or so to speak, or that diagnostic tool was helpful for me in jiggling loose if I felt stuck.
Yeah.
And it may not work for everybody else, but for me it was very helpful.
And you see, I would say it's even simpler. That when as soon as I'm having a low feeling, I don't have to figure out what I'm thinking or how I'm thinking about it. It just, in that instant, it's like, whoa, my feeling is always a barometer of the clarity and quality of my thinking. And the closer I am to my default nature, the clearer my thinking, the higher quality my thinking, the more creative and resilient I am.
That your default position is happiness, you say?
Yes.
And so are you saying for yourself then, you just by recognizing that you're having a feeling, you can kind of shift into the default happiness? But I'm not clear, how do you do that? How do you figure out what you do to make that shift, or is it a spontaneous process for you that?
It is spontaneous. It's not, and I would differentiate spontaneous from instantaneous. Okay.
Okay.
Let me see. I lost my train of thought for a minute. Where was I going?
About the default setting, that when if you get a hold of your thoughts and feelings.
Oh, I know. Yes, that feeling is an infallible barometer of the quality of my thinking, and that when my feeling state drops, what I know is that my thinking in that moment is, and I mean, and in one sense this is really obvious, but in my experience we don't really recognize how important this is. When our feeling states drop, we can conclude that the quality of our thinking has taken a dive, and therefore we don't invest in whatever thinking is going on at the time. Like, I just know not to go down that road. So if I'm having stressful thoughts about my business and my mood drops, I know not to invest in thinking more, harder, deeper, faster in that state, that's not going to help, because I can tell that the quality of my thinking is compromised, and there's no way to get there. But as soon as I recognize that, it's like, whoa, my thinking is really compromised, I'm in a low mood, what I'm experiencing is not the problems in my business, what I'm experiencing is thought, that in that realization, the system begins to reset.
Very interesting. All right, so it's like the negative mood at the time is a kind of a signpost for you to kind of not go into the thoughts, but to shift out of the thoughts through meditation and taking a walk.
Or to let the thought shift, to let it shift. And
very interesting. I was wondering, are there other people on the line now?
I was just going to check in. Who else is here? Aurelia, are you still around?
I am here.
What are you hearing, and what's going on for you?
Well, it's interesting because I talk to a lot of my friends who are not in my same city, and we talk on the phone quite often about being single and, you know, how depressing that can be, all that good stuff. And I was listening to one of my friends who reconnected with an old boyfriend just recently, and, you know, she went on and on about, you know, still some negative things about the relationship and how it's impacting her and her life and how that's all she dreamed of. And I just stopped her and I said, you know what, just choose to be happy. Just choose it. Just choose it.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I said. And she just shifted and was like, oh my God, you're right. She's like, he's done so many great things this time, and all I keep thinking about is the past, about the stuff he didn't do. And I was like, just choose to be happy. And it's hard sometimes, but I think that's really, sometimes for me, I have to just sit there and say, choose to be happy. To myself, to others, or what have you. Because I think you can get stuck in this downward spiral.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to, and it is thoughts, it really is.
Mm-hmm.
But really what it comes down to when I thought about it and when I was talking to my friend, and she realized it, it's really, sometimes people have a fear of being happy.
A fear of being happy.
Yeah, and because if you think about it, happiness is also vulnerability. When you're happy, you can also be vulnerable. It's kind of easy to be depressed and like sad. It really is. No one's gonna test you. No one's gonna, you know, people kind of understand people in that step. When people are happy, people test them. People do things, but it should be okay. It's just out of fear that people are kind of messing with that, if you will.
Huh.
And I realized in talking to my friends that that's what she was doing. She was afraid to be happy with this guy. It's easier to complain about what he does and what he doesn't do and how he makes her feel sometimes and all that good stuff.
Right.
The reality is, it really is great to be happy. You're going on, he planned a trip to Hawaii, you know, he did all these other great things. Like, why not just be happy about that?
Well, you know, what occurs to me, Aurelia, is that if we're afraid to be happy, and I'm just going to see if this is maybe what you meant, it's because we think something could be taken away from us.
Correct.
Right. Right. And yet, when we recognize that happiness isn't a function of anything outside of us, that nothing can be taken, that nothing that makes you happy can be taken away from you, then choosing to be happy makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. You know,
I'm not saying that's easy, but it's something that I'm trying to work on now as well.
Well, right. Sometimes we get a lot of momentum behind unhappy thoughts or low moods, and we get into a groove with them. And if we think, let me see. Well, there's a way in which I think innocently we have come to understand unhappiness as something that needs to be, that can threaten us. One, it's something that can threaten us, and something that needs to be fixed. And this actually connects, Ellen, to what I was saying about not getting too hung up on tools and techniques. Because if we think that unhappiness is something that needs to be fixed, we tend to invest more attention and concern there than we need to. If we recognize that unhappiness and low moods are temporary, that they're part of a flow of experience. One way to think about it is like weather. you don't have to feel okay to be okay. The sun doesn't go away just because it's cloudy. And that when we recognize that, there's an underlying sense of okayness that we can contact. And that's there for us, independent of circumstances. That's there for us. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's so much going through my mind that I took a course many years ago called the Sedona Method. And
Yes.
the Sedona Method, the way I learned it, it doesn't exist anymore. Many people have taken the Sedona Method and changed the technique. When I learned it in the mid-'80s, unfortunately, that it's not available anymore, and it's a different course entirely. But it really changed my life, and it was, again, more of a technique than, I guess, what you're speaking of. But I love the notion of Sedona Method because their perspective was that we have feelings, and they didn't use this metaphor, but I do, like layers of an onion skin.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we're feeling anger, a lot of times we try to change the anger, and then the Sedona Method would suggest don't try to change it, kind of like what you're saying, Molly. And then, but what really happens next in the Sedona Method teaching is that feeling of anger releases.
Right.
It was also known as the release technique. And underneath that anger is usually sadness and hurt or fear. But then instead of trying to change the feeling of sadness, hurt, or fear, you feel it intensely, and then it shifts spontaneously, and then maybe there's more anger. And then that technique helps you just go release the layers of feelings until you get to a place of peace. And I think it's a very interesting technique because, but then that's suggesting a more active approach to clearing away layers of feelings to get to what our true nature is, which is peace.
Right.
In any moment. And I think everybody, I think if we had more people on the phone right now, we might be able to ask, everybody, well, what's your technique? What do you do? And I think probably everybody would have a different technique of how they jiggle it loose to get to that default happiness. Or if happiness is not their default setting, if they were not born happy, then what do they do to fight their genetics and get there? Because I think there are people who might not be gifted with all the serotonin they need, and have to work hard on it. So I think every human being is different. Very interesting. Are there any other people on the line? I'd love to hear other people's experience with this.
Yeah,
Or most people.
Is there anyone on the line who hasn't checked in? I didn't hear any other tones indicating new callers. I think most people are watching on the Google page.
Do they have any way to write?
Sure. If you're watching this in Google Plus, feel free to use the chat function and chime in about what your experience is of happiness as a default, and what you think of the conversation so far. What's going on for you?
And I'm also interested with while we're waiting for that, and I forget your name. Is it Aurelia who's on the line?
Yes.
I'm Ellen there. How do you just be happy? What's your technique? I'm curious how you just decide to be happy and do it. That's the great thing you do. Can you teach other people to do what you do?
I think it's, even from the example that I mentioned, I think you just have to be conscious of, and it's sort of a combination of everything that we talked about, and especially you, Ellen. I think for me, I have to be conscious of what I'm exposing myself to. I'm very vulnerable to people when they're being negative, and it brings me down.
Yeah,
and I'm very, right. And so, I'm very vulnerable to images, to songs, to, I'm just vulnerable to it. So it took me a long time to realize that. And so there are days where I can't talk to certain people because I know they may steal my joy, if you will. I know that I need to surround myself around positivity, either it be nature, friends that are positive, just sitting with myself with positive thoughts. So I think I think I am more of a doer of trying to achieve that happiness, because I don't want. I am so susceptible to that negativity. It really debilitates me at times.
Very interesting. And have you heard the work of Judith Orloff? She talks about some people with their energy sensitive, and you recognize that you're very vulnerable, and that's a great awareness, you know, that you're vulnerable to other people's energies.
But what we're always experiencing is inside out. So describing it in terms of response to external circumstances isn't actually accurate, because even as you were saying, Aurelia, there are days when you can be around someone who's negative and you're fine, and other days when you're around somebody who's negative and it steals your joy. So it's not that external person or circumstance that's affecting your happiness. It's your internal mental constructs. Do you see that?
I do. I do. Because at the end of the day, it really is you. You know. So I do.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm wanting for people is to realize that we don't have to be afraid of what I was calling the weather a little while ago. We don't have to be afraid of the ups and downs of the human experience. If we really get that the worst thing that's ever going on, the absolute worst thing that's ever going on is thought generated, that we are always underneath that, free and whole and safe, then we don't get terrorized by our moods and our shifting states of mind. And the less terrorized we are, the less afraid we are of our human experience, the more fluid that experience becomes. And the more fluid that experience becomes, the lighter it is. And the lighter it is, the less intense those negative things are. So they tend to move through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah.
And as you're speaking, do you want to say something, Aurelia?
No, it doesn't. No, I agree too.
Yeah, but what was going on in my mind, you know, because I have been trained as a psychotherapist, I was thinking of, you know, if people here, you know, have a trigger to something, you know, whether it's they're sensitive to feeling violated or betrayed, you know, they may benefit from psychotherapy, you know, to go back and see, well, what's the origin of that sensitivity? You know, maybe there was a trauma in childhood. You know,
well,
therapy.
but
yeah.
if pain is the product of thought, how is it helpful to go back into a painful past in order to get better?
Psychotherapy doesn't, you know, just through some sessions, whether it's gestalt therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy or hypnotherapy, you know, that can be very useful to something called inner child healing. That's the technique I've used with my patients. So, you know, there's a trauma, you know, sometimes going back and reworking. A lot of times things are unconscious and they're pushed into the unconscious. It's almost like a window on the computer that's reduced but still running. And so sometimes people can do it themselves. Sometimes people might benefit from a little help with a good licensed psychotherapist.
You see, what I've realized after, and I've done lots of different therapies and things, and what I've come to realize is that what's ultimately freeing in any therapy or spiritual practice I've done is not the practice or the therapy in itself, but that there comes a point in it where I have the insight that, oh my God, I've been carrying this in my mind. I've been carrying this in my thinking. This isn't happening now. I'm free. And that insight is available to us anytime we can see that we're living in the feeling of our thinking, not our circumstances.
I mean, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if people can do that, that's great. I think it's wonderful you found this technique. I think for some people, maybe they need a little help to jiggle it loose. If it's pushed so deeply unconscious, they may not have the ability to access the unconscious memories that are...
Well, the wonderful thing is, because, you know, a lot of things are unconscious, that iceberg of thought, we're only conscious of, you know, maybe 5 or 10% of our thinking in a day. But if we recognize that all we're ever experiencing is the product of thought, I don't have to know what the thought is.
Okay, let me think about that.
Yeah.
I think you bring up a very good idea. Sure. I mean, if people can do that, that's great. I don't know. I think some people just can't unjiggle it. You know, and I don't know. I've worked with people where, you know, it didn't take years of therapy, maybe, you know, 10 sessions, boom. You know, something was there that they couldn't access and brought it up to light. And then when things are brought to conscious awareness, they can manage it better. And I think it's an enormously complex topic that we're dealing with today. I think it's so fascinating. You know, that's why I joined the call. I think on some level it could be so simple, you know, of being happy when you have a piece of bread, you know, and shifting the cultural elements of our happiness to maybe it's complicated and we need deep psychotherapy. And I just wish we had more people on the call today to you know, chew it around a little bit more, because I think it's a hugely fascinating topic. And I don't know, is there any chat coming through?
No, there aren't no chats so far.
Okay.
Yep.
Monica.
Monica, hi.
Hi. I just joined you, folks. I want to say, first of all, thank you, Molly. I've been following you for a while, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Monica. It's great to have you here. Have you been...
Yeah, I just wanted to give just a little bit of feedback. Having been in the process of this positivity route, I think one of the things that's helped me the most is to be on the path of figuring myself out. And as you've said before so adequately, you know, this whole path is about our own process and where we are. And the external, although it affects us, is really just a vignette going on inside what's going on in ourselves. And for me, just, although it sounds kind of hypocritical, accepting the dark moments, accepting that dark goddess that I am, accepting the different components of my personality, although they aren't happy all the time, make me into a happier person when I look at the whole picture and I can embrace all of the components in myself. So that's just what I wanted to put out there.
Yeah, you know, what comes to my mind, Monica, is I remember a day, a particular time when I had the realization that there's no part of myself that I want to leave out. And I think that relates in a way to what I've been saying about not needing to fear the human experience. And it's an amazing, amazing thing that is sometimes sad, sometimes terrifying, sometimes wonderful, and whatever the experience in the moment is, I think it's a miracle. I think it's a marvel that we're alive and we have the capacity to generate a life, to generate relationships, to generate experience.
I agree. I remember being in therapy and my therapist talking to me more about embracing my dark side. And I thought, what do you mean? My dark side? I want to be happy. I want to be a positive person. But I realized that it was really important for me to look at all those aspects just for the greater good and to change my whole human experience. And I feel like it actually has done that.
Well, I just, a little notice popped up in my Google dashboard that we need to be wrapping this up. I want to thank everybody. I do hope in future Hangouts that we'll have more folks, this being the very first one in just a couple days' notice. There are only a few of us, and I will be sending emails to invite people again, and I really appreciate folks who showed up and those of you who are listening to a replay. And the one point, if I were going to make, actually I've got 2 points that I'm going to offer as takeaways, and perhaps we can even discuss this in the comments section of the replay page. And the first is that we live in the feeling of our thinking, so that our relative sense of happiness or unhappiness in any moment is always generated by thought. That below that, there's a foundation of well-being or happiness. That's our nature. And that connecting with that foundation can be as simple as remembering that any other experience we're having is always the result of thought in the moment. And that, as I said before, we're always safe in our seats. No matter how scary the movie, there is a way in which our human essence, we're safe in our seats. So I want to thank everybody for showing up, especially Ellen and Aurelia and Monica. I appreciate you coming and sharing and being live on the call today. And I hope everyone will be here on the second Friday of September. I believe that's September 12th at the same time. That's 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.